A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you so much for tuning into another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. It is great to have you with us. Did you watch any of the 3-hour-long Democratic debate last night? I confess, I did not watch it live. Nope. I was hanging out with my wife, having a good time, enjoying ourselves. But I did catch the replay late yesterday evening. I saw the exchange between Beto O'Rourke and Pete Buttigieg regarding Beto's plan for a gun ban and a quote-unquote buyback. Now, the government cannot buy back what it did not sell to you, so this is not a buyback. This is a compensated confiscation plan. You were told to hand over the firearms that Beto wants to ban, and in exchange for handing over those firearms to the government, you get a little bit of cash. Beto has been trying to punch up. He's polling about 2% right now, and he's been going after Pete Buttigieg because Buttigieg says, come on, that's crazy. We don't need to do that. We need to just go ahead and ban these guns now and worry about those people who possess the guns at some future point. He is not right now in favor of a compensated confiscation scheme. And he kind of tore into Beto last night. Now, Beto's been still trying to explain how his plan would actually work. Anderson Cooper on CNN asked him last night, all right, so what happens if people don't comply with your ban? And he said, well, I think that people will. I think that most Americans will comply, and I'm just counting on the fact that most Americans are going to do so. He was on MSNBC this morning talking to Joe Scarborough, and he actually said that, if people don't comply and they're out there talking about, not giving up their guns, then we'll have to go to their home. Law enforcement will have to go to their home and take those firearms. Now, again, this is a flailing campaign right now, and Beto doesn't know what the hell to say. I think what Beto really wants to say, and what I would encourage him to say, is, I don't believe that you have a right to keep and bear arms. I believe it is a privilege. I've been telling Beto O'Rourke, just call for the full repeal of the Second Amendment, because what you're calling for right now is plainly unconstitutional. Plainly unconstitutional. But instead, he keeps trying to find some sort of, I don't know what the heck he's looking for, some sort of middle ground here. So after telling national television that, anybody who doesn't comply, law enforcement is probably going to come to their door, his rapid response director, having to do some damage control here, Lauren Hitt, taking to Twitter, saying, quote, Beto would not send officers door to door to collect weapons, just as we do not send the IRS door to door to collect taxes. And then Lauren Hitt repeated this mantra from Beto O'Rourke: with any law in this country, there are a few people who may not comply, but the overwhelming majority of Americans do voluntarily comply with our laws, even when they don't like them, and we have every reason to expect that Americans would do the same with a buyback. Do you really have every expectation? What would give you that expectation, for God's sakes? Beto O'Rourke is out there calling for not only the decriminalization and the legalization of cannabis, which, by the way, I support, but he's calling for expunging of records for the millions of Americans who have low-level drug offenses on their records. Why? Because millions of Americans have not complied with the prohibition on cannabis around the United States. And Beto O'Rourke's, most people comply with the law. Now, he wants to change federal drug law because there are a lot of people who aren't complying with that law. But never mind. You're not allowed to bring that up. You're not allowed to talk about that. Instead, most people will comply. Again, if you want to just limit this to guns and firearms, where on earth do you get that idea that most Americans are going to comply with a federal order telling them to hand over their legally owned, at least heretofore, legally owned firearms? It's not going to happen. In New York State, under the SAFE Act, all owners of said so-called assault weapons were supposed to register them with the state. This wasn't even about confiscating. This was just registration. It's estimated that the compliance rate less than 5%. In the state of New Jersey, where gun owners were told, hey, listen, if you have any magazines that can hold more than 10 rounds, you can't own them anymore. You need to turn them over to law enforcement. You got to get them out of the state. You got to destroy them, but you can't own them anymore. It's estimated the compliance rate is about 0%. Yeah. So what on earth gives Beto O'Rourke the idea that Americans are just going, well, I don't like this law that says that this gun that I legally owned for years and years, I now have to hand over to the government. But okay, I'll comply. What on earth gives him that idea that Americans would do this? The fact of the matter is that Beto O'Rourke does not have an actual honest-to-goodness plan. He has a vision, right? If we pass the law, then people will obey it. And he doesn't want to think about what happens when Americans don't. Now, there are millions of Americans right now who own AR-15s, AK-47s, other semi-automatic rifles that Beto wants to ban. Millions of Americans. There are right now less than 30,000 Americans who are in federal prison on weapons charges of all kinds. So what happens if, let's say, 2 million Americans, which would not even be a majority of those owners of semi-automatic firearms, but let's say 2 million Americans say, no, I'm not gonna hand over my guns. I've got a right to own these firearms, and I'm not gonna give them to the federal government. What does Beto O'Rourke do? Again, he doesn't really have a plan. He says, well, we could fine them. We'll take their gun, but we'll fine them. But, we're not really talking about prison time. At least Eric Swalwell was talking about some sort of prison time, but Beto O'Rourke can't. Because, again, what is your plan to imprison several million Americans who say, no, I'm not going to abide with this gun law? Beto O'Rourke doesn't have a plan. I don't even really think he has a real platform. And despite the fact that he's been getting these sorts of questions for weeks, his answers haven't gotten any better when it comes to how do you actually enforce, or what would you do to enforce this proposed ban and compensated confiscation scheme. Now, if you're not a Beto O'Rourke fan, the good news is he's polling at around 2%. He raised a pretty paltry sum in the third quarter, and right now, he hasn't qualified for November's Democratic presidential campaign debate. So we may soon be seeing the end of the Beto O'Rourke campaign, and it remains to be seen if any other candidate out there will pick up his gun ban and gun confiscation mantra, which, of course, he took from Eric Swalwell after Eric Swalwell dropped out of the race. All right, now there is another story I want to talk about today. Before we get to our armed citizen story, our good deed of the day, our recidivism report, we told you a couple of days ago, you may have seen this story on BuryingArms.com, about a man named Stephen Nichols. He's 84 years of age. He lives on Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. He is a Korean War veteran. He is a law enforcement veteran. He is a school crossing guard right now, and he's a gun owner. And he had his gun seized. He had his job taken from him by police. This did not involve, by the way, the state's red flag law. This all came about after a conversation that Stephen Nichols had over breakfast in a local diner. We talked with Jim Wallace, who's the executive director of the Gun Owners Action League in Massachusetts, about the Nichols case and about the Massachusetts law that allows for the chief to declare on a whim, your local police chief, on a whim, can decide that all of a sudden you are an unsuitable person who is no longer allowed to legally possess their firearms. Take a look and a listen. Jim Wallace, thank you so much, sir, for coming on the program. It's good talking with you today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Welcome back to the Second Amendment battleground state, the old tagline, right?
Yeah, right. And it is a battleground. Stephen Nichols, he's seen his share of combat, a Korean War veteran. He was a law enforcement officer for decades. Now he's a school crossing guard. But last week he had his job taken from him, and he had his guns taken from him, Jim, because when he was apparently having breakfast at a diner on Martha's Vineyard where he lives and works, he's talking to somebody at the next stool over, I guess, and he was complaining about the school resource officer there at the Tinbury School in Tinbury, Mass. And, Mr. Nichols says this guy, once the kids get into school, this guy's going and he's getting coffee. And he says, someone could come in and shoot up the school because he's not there on the job. Apparently a waitress overhears this, perceives this to be a threat, contacts the police. And while Mr. Nichols is serving as a crossing guard, cops come out. They say, listen, you're no longer doing this. And by the way, you need to give us your guns, Jim.
Yeah. The sad thing is, Cam, and we've talked about this throughout the years, is This wasn't even a red flag thing. This was our normal, unfortunately, chief's discretion in Massachusetts, where for whatever reason they can suddenly just knock on your door, tell you you're an unsuitable person, take your guns and your license, and then you have to fight it. And it's one of those things where this was a severe overreaction, in my opinion. Now, we always want to make sure that we're paying attention to warning signs that we see, but the police probably should have known this guy, and they should have just gone up and talked to him at first and found out the story, and they didn't. They didn't even take those steps. They went right to overreaction, and we always get the excuse that, well, we're afraid not to overreact because then if something happens, we get the blame. Well, yeah, but you also have to use some restraint, especially when it comes to people's civil rights. And once again, it didn't happen here in Massachusetts.
Well, no, and we hear, gun control activists talk all the time about we're just looking for common sense gun safety regulations. There's nothing commonsensical about this. The police chief came out and said, okay, yes, he's got his job back as a crossing guard after the outcry from the community. And I'm glad that there was that outcry. I'm glad he's got his job back, but he still doesn't have his guns back. He's had to engage an attorney. They're fighting this, at 84 years of age. This man is now fighting with his local police department to get the firearms that he legally owns back in his possession. And again, red flag laws didn't come into this at all. This is simply the discretion that the chiefs have in the state of Massachusetts, that they can turn you into a, what's the term, unsuitable person?
The unsuitable person, or sometimes we call it a felon in waiting. But it's sad. Can you imagine the outcry, in the legislature and everywhere else, if chiefs in Massachusetts or anywhere else had this kind of discretion for driver's licenses, which is a privilege. It's not a civil right. Can you imagine if, mom and dad are sitting there at the kitchen table with their teenage kids, and suddenly a police chief comes up and drags your daughter outside, takes your driver's license, and then tows the car and doesn't give any explanation and there's no charges filed, and then you have to go to court to fight for your car back and your driver's license back. That would never stand in this country, anywhere in this country, I don't think.
No, no, but you're right. That's exactly what happened here, because Mr. Nichols wasn't ever charged with anything. He wasn't arrested. He was just told, you're no longer a crossing guard, and by the way, you're no longer a legal gun owner. Jim, how often do you run into stories like this where without charges being filed, people are having their guns taken from them?
Well, actually, it's interesting you say that, because just last night down in West Bridgewater, and people can Google it, there was a story where a few friends, I think there were 4 of them, they took a boat downriver way into the woods, and they had like a makeshift campsite, and they were doing some target shooting in the woods. And a neighbor called the police and said a bullet struck her window and landed on the kitchen table, which is kind of fishy. But the next thing these guys knew, there was a state police helicopter over their heads telling them to, basically unload the guns and proceed back to the boat ramp, and police will be waiting for you. And, one of the guys called us and said, we came down the ramp just figuring they wanted to check out who we are. And next thing we know, that we come and this gun's drawn. And there was a guy, one officer up on the bridge, with a rifle covering him. And he says, it was pretty darn scary. He goes, the next thing you know, we're in handcuffs. They're bringing us down to the station. They confiscate our guns. They confiscate our license, but no charges were filed. So, we have no idea how to proceed here. And herein lies another problem, Cam, is that we're always told by the other side, well, yeah, but you have the right to appeal. Well, wait a minute now. What about due process? And the fact that in some of these cases, you didn't even get to the point where due process should have happened. It should have been just a conversation. But now you got to bankrupt your family to get your rights back and to get your property back and maybe try to clear your name. That's just unacceptable.
Absolutely. And a decade on after the Heller decision, I mean, it sounds like a lot of this, Jim, it just stems from the fact that Massachusetts still considers your right to keep and bear arms to not be a right at all. It is a privilege in the state of Massachusetts still to this day.
And that's what they consider it. I mean, we run into this all the time, whether it's at the State House or, with the news media. But when I was recently in the State House at a public safety hearing, and one of the legislators, a state rep, was questioning me about why we opposed mandatory live fire training. And he mentioned that, I'm a shipboat captain and I have to get training all the time and I have to do this and that. And, when I get my driver's license, I had to go through driver's ed. And I had to remind them that, Representative, none of the things you mentioned is a civil right. And they kind of look at you funny when you say civil right. And it's one of those things that I've never used the term gun rights. I hate that term because when you say gun rights, it's so easy for them to say, oh, it's just a gun. But you really need to use the terms that they understand because it is a civil right. And, I know that a lot of our members sometimes go, Jim, it's not a civil right, it's an inalienable right. But the general public has no idea what that means, nor can they probably spell it. So, let's use terms they can understand in simple to, understand terms. But it's indeed a civil right, and it should be treated like all other civil rights, and it's just not.
Do you think that a case like Mr. Nichols there in Martha's Vineyard, obviously that's not going to change every heart and mind in the legislature, unfortunately, but does a story like what happened to Stephen Nichols and the fact that it has gotten some attention, and there are folks in Massachusetts, many of whom I guess are not even gun owners, who are still very bothered by what happened to this gentleman, does this give gun owners and the Gun Owners Action League in Massachusetts an opportunity to start a conversation about how this civil right is treated in the state?
Yeah, it does, and it also points to a piece of legislation that has been filed for us for about 6 years now. That the right to keep and bear arms shall be paramount in all decisions about whatever is going on. So, in other words, when they go into something, the government, the police, whoever, have to keep in mind that the right to keep and bear arms exists in all cases, and it's incumbent upon you to prove that there's something wrong, not the other way around. So, and that's one of the things that we're starting to change here in Mass, even though it's a small change. A law we got passed back in, I think it's 2014, but it's not going to take effect until 2021, is that even though it's a small step, compared to other things, they will actually have to give you in writing reasons why they're either denying, restricting, or revoking your license, so that when you go to court, you have a specific document that you can present to the court and fight against. Because right now they don't have to. They don't have to give you anything.
Yeah, that happened with Mr. Nichols. I don't even think they gave him a receipt for the guns that were taken. And there was nothing in writing about why this was happening. So you're right. That is a small change. And we've also got the Supreme Court that's set to hear December 2nd oral arguments in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus New York City. And this is a case dealing with the New York City law, but there's the possibility, and I think that there's the hope among gun owners that the Supreme Court is also going to weigh in, not just on that specific law, but the standard of review that is being used by courts around the country to uphold a lot of these gun control laws. And so, depending on what the court says, you might be able to get some judicial relief. The Supreme Court's already done that in Massachusetts with the Catano case a few years ago, telling the state of Massachusetts your stun gun ban is unconstitutional. So maybe indirectly, gun owners in Massachusetts might benefit from this challenge to a New York City law.
Well, you mentioned the Catano decision, and Massachusetts is pretty bad when even Justice Ginsburg signs on to a decision for us. We actually called that the Mass SG Smackdown. It was just, wow, they couldn't believe that even Justice Ginsburg signed on to it and said, no, you guys aren't paying attention. Even the others in the court that don't like the Second Amendment, they were outraged by the Massachusetts courts not recognizing the past court's decisions, and they just won't stand for that.
Yeah. Well, and again, there's all kinds of abuse of that nature going on there in Massachusetts. In the meantime, what is your advice to anybody who finds themselves in a situation like Mr. Nichols, where, again, somebody overhears a conversation and the next thing you know, police are saying, all right, you're unsuitable. You got to give us your guns.
Yeah, well, the first thing you got to do is you have to make sure that you have legal counsel, because a lot of people go into this without legal counsel. And even, I'm not sure what happened in West Bridgewater, but they were brought down for questioning. And first thing we said is, do you have legal counsel? And they said no. And it's like, oh, that can be a really bad mistake in Massachusetts. So I know it's expensive, but if you can't, don't talk to anybody until you talk to legal counsel, and don't think that just because you're in a scary situation that you can be basically bullied into cooperating or answering questions that you shouldn't be. And it's very sad, Cam, because we're big law enforcement supporters, but we always tell our members, because the law enforcement community doesn't understand the gun laws and doesn't understand their responsibilities in the gun laws, that unfortunately you should really avoid interactions with law enforcement when it comes to your guns. So give us a call. We'll do everything we can to help you out, at least get you pointed in the right direction. But, unfortunately, your life just changed drastically if you're in one of these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim Wallace, Executive Director of the Gun Owners Action League there in Massachusetts. Appreciate all that you do, sir, and appreciate you joining us on the program today.
All right, Cam, we'll talk to you soon.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, let's get to our armed citizen story, our good deed of the day, and the recidivism report. This one we're going to call the recidivism report. Out of Oregon, where a home intruder has been arrested again. Christian Chisholm. By the way, if you watch The Office, does that guy not look like Toby from HR, who just fell on some really, really hard times there? Fairview, Oregon. This guy was found in a 6-year-old girl's bedroom over the weekend. And according to KGW Channel 8 in Portland, he has been arrested 3 times in the past week. Yeah. The Multnomah County DA's office says that Chisholm also goes by the aliases Brent Chisholm, Christian Chisholm, and James Ralph James. He was detained after he was caught in the 6-year-old girl's bedroom, but he was not booked into jail. According to KGW, the jail turned him away because he had an injury that needed medical treatment. So instead, he was cited and released. The family says they were traumatized by what happened, but Chisholm was charged with a low-level misdemeanor and likely would have been released within hours of being booked into jail. He broke into a home. So the day after he breaks into this home and is discovered in a 6-year-old girl's bedroom, he's arrested again, October 13th, for criminal trespass at a home in Northwest Portland. He was booked into jail and let out a few hours later. He had a court date for Monday of this week. He didn't show up. Now there's a warrant for his arrest. KGW says, if you look at his record, you'll find that he has a history of skipping court. In 2017, Chisholm failed to appear in court 17 times. By the time he was sentenced, this is in one case. By the time he was sentenced in that one case, he received 10 days in jail with credit for time served. August 25th, he was booked into jail twice within a few hours. So KGW goes to the local law enforcement and says, okay, how is this happening? How is this guy breaking into people's homes? He's caught there, and then it's like catch and release. What's going on? This is the statement by the Multnomah County spokesperson at the Department of Community Justice. Anytime someone wakes to find a stranger in their house, it's alarming and frightening. The district attorney's office and the courts will work to hold the defendant accountable for the most recent incident. His prior arrests were misdemeanor charges that qualify for expedited release per policy. The county is working with all of its partners to address the processing of defendants throughout the entire public safety systems, particularly for defendants who may be eligible for intervention programs. If the defendant comes into the custody of the Department of Community Justice, we will work with him to provide appropriate supervision or other intervention as needed. Really? Blah, 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 blah. Talk about saying nothing at all. KGW is also told that Chisholm's been released from jail so many times because his charges are low-level misdemeanors. Yeah, and they say that they've learned that the system overall is looking for more ways to address cases like Chisholm's. It seems to me like there are so many felony laws on the books these days that you could probably charge him with one of them. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the answer is if you break into somebody's house where you're not supposed to be and they don't know who you are, it's a felony. Maybe that's the answer. So that individuals like Mr. Chisholm are not time and time again, sometimes day in and day out, committing these crimes, breaking these laws, and then getting put right back out onto the streets. Now, In Alabama, we got another story about a burglar. This one ends up a little bit differently than the one with Mr. Chisholm. Anniston, Alabama, where a homeowner actually found a burglary suspect in his home. That's the smiling face of somebody who got caught where he shouldn't have been. That is Brian Scott Young, who is old enough to know better. He's 37. He's been charged with first-degree burglary. He's from Weaver, Alabama. It was early Sunday morning, police said, when he broke into an Anniston home. He was armed at the time, but the homeowner there in Anniston, Alabama, was also armed and was able to hold that burglary suspect at gunpoint until police arrived. I don't believe that Mr. Weaver has bonded out of jail yet, so maybe they do things a little bit differently. Maybe the presence of the firearm in the hand of that burglary suspect was enough to elevate those charges from a misdemeanor to a felony, but either way, doesn't sound like Mr. Weaver is going to go through the same slap on the wrist system that Mr. Chisholm is currently experiencing there in Portland, Oregon. Now, our good deed of the day from South Carolina, North Charleston, South Carolina, where a police officer saved the life of a 19-month-old girl who was choking on food. It was last Wednesday. Jared Riley, heading back to the North Charleston Police Headquarters after an event. He was driving down the road. He saw a car driving erratically, and the driver was honking their horn. So he said he slowed down to initiate a traffic stop. And when the vehicles stopped, he said, before I could even put my car in park, he said, the mom and the passenger jumped out of the car, running back to my vehicle, screaming, my child can't breathe. She can't breathe. And then I just relied on my training, he said, at that point. So he said, I flipped her upside down on her stomach, braced her on my left hand, patted her on the back, and then I swiped her mouth once, made sure the objects were out, and then she started crying at that point. Once you hear that cry, you know that the airway is not obstructed. You know that you're good to go. Sometimes people don't like to hear the sound of babies crying or toddlers crying, but when they can't breathe, that's the best sound on earth. He said, I also have a 2-year-old child, so I have some CPR training with infants and toddlers as well. He said the little girl's mom trying to get her to the hospital when she ran across Officer Riley. He said at that point, with lights and everything, I'd say they were probably 5 to 10 minutes away. He said it could have ended badly. It could have been devastating. Instead, little girl was taken by EMS to the local hospital. She was checked out. She's going to be just fine. And Jared Riley says, I guess God put me in the right place at the right time. He says, I was grateful to be able to save that child. He says, it's a good thing to do. He says, I did not get into this community just to arrest people. I got into this to help people. And over the weekend, Jared Riley had the chance to do exactly that. We thank him for being in the right place at the right time, and able to do the right thing, and for that very good deed indeed. That is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. I want to thank you for being a part of the program today. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the program as a podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, as well as townhall.com's podcast page. You can also subscribe to Town Hall Media at YouTube, and that way you don't miss a show if you like the video version of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. We'll be back tomorrow with more of the nation's top Second Amendment news and information. And again, in the meantime, we thank you for watching, for listening, for spreading the word. We'll see you back here soon with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company.